A security guard walks a quiet cul-de-sac in West Houston. It's the morning of August 23rd, 1990. A white Honda Civic hasn't moved in hours. He approaches. Inside, a purse. Shoes. No driver. He calls it in. Minutes later, officers find a young woman's body in the woods nearby, covered with wooden boards. Then, a young man tied to a tree. Both are in their early 20s. Both had their entire lives ahead of them the night before. For 36 years, no one would know who did this.
The Case Chronicle.
In August of 1990, West Houston looked nothing like it does today. The area around Enclave Parkway, now part of the Energy Corridor, all glass office towers and corporate campuses, was still largely undeveloped. Long stretches of unlit road cut through brush and trees. Locals had their own name for one particular pull-off near a cul-de-sac, Lover's Lane. Cheryl Henry was 22 years old. Friends and family remembered her as warm, outgoing, and full of energy, the kind of person who lit up a room. She was close with her sisters and her parents, and like a lot of young adults in Houston at the time, she loved the city's nightlife and live music scene. Garland Atkinson. Everyone called him Andy, was 21. He had a reputation for being easygoing and good-humored, the kind of person people simply liked being around. By the summer of 1990, Cheryl and Andy had only recently started dating. It was early in the relationship, that stage where everything feels new and the future feels wide open. On the night of August 22nd, the two of them went out together, along with one of Cheryl's sisters, to a nightclub on Westheimer Road called Bayou Mama's. It was an ordinary night. Drinks, music, friends. At some point, Cheryl's sister left the group and went home. Cheryl and Andy stayed behind. What happened after they left the club that night would remain a mystery for 36 years. The couple drove to that stretch near Enclave Parkway. Whatever happened next, it ended with both of them dead before morning. The next day, neither Cheryl nor Andy showed up for work. For Cheryl, that alone was a warning sign. She had just started her job, and by every account, she loved it too much to simply not show up. Her family began making calls. Nobody had heard from her. Concern turned to alarm. That same morning, a security guard employed by Cisco Foods was doing a routine patrol near the 1300 block of Enclave Parkway. He noticed something odd. A car parked at the end of a cul-de-sac that hadn't moved in hours. It was Andy's car. The guard walked over for a closer look. Inside, he found Cheryl's purse and a pair of shoes. But no Cheryl, no Andy. He called the Houston Police Department. Officers arrived and began searching the surrounding wooded area. It didn't take long. They found Cheryl's body first, hidden in the brush, deliberately covered with wooden boards, as if someone had taken the time to conceal what they'd done rather than simply flee. A short distance away, they found Andy. He had been tied to a tree, his throat cut so deeply that he was nearly decapitated. Investigators would later determine, from the positioning of the crime scene, that Andy had very likely been forced to listen while Cheryl was attacked first. Tied helplessly to that tree, aware of what was happening, and aware of what was almost certainly coming for him next. Andy's father would later describe that realization as one of the hardest things he ever had to accept. There was another detail that struck investigators as strange enough to remember decades later. The killer had used Andy's own golf clubs and golf balls, taken from the trunk of his car, seemingly to mark or point the way toward where Cheryl's body was hidden. A $20 bill was found lying near the scene, its significance never explained. Both victims were pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner's report confirmed Cheryl had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. For a case this violent and this deliberate, Houston homicide detectives threw everything they had at it. They processed the scene, collected biological evidence, including material recovered during Cheryl's autopsy that would, decades later, turn out to be the single most important piece of the entire case, and interviewed everyone who had seen the couple that night. But 1990 was a different world for forensic science. DNA testing existed, technically, but it was slow, expensive, and nowhere near sophisticated enough to search for a stranger with no other leads. Investigators had biological evidence. What they didn't have was any way to turn that evidence into a name. Weeks became months. Months became years. The case did not fade from Houston's collective memory. If anything, it became more deeply embedded in it. The Lovers Lane murders became one of those cases everyone in the city seemed to know by name, even people who weren't born yet when it happened. The investigation itself never fully stopped, even when it had nothing new to work with. In 2001, someone mailed a letter to the Houston Police Department offering information about the killer's identity in exchange for $100,000. Detectives couldn't determine whether it was a genuine lead or a cruel hoax. Either way, it went nowhere, and the case stayed cold. In 2007, 17 years after the murders, some of the preserved biological evidence was finally tested using DNA technology that hadn't existed in 1990. What investigators found was their first real breakthrough in nearly 2 decades. The DNA profile from the Lovers Lane crime scene matched evidence from a separate, earlier case. The rape of a woman in North Harris County, just weeks before Cheryl and Andy were killed. That victim had left her job at a nightclub and gone to her boyfriend's house in Northwest Houston when a man showed up, claiming he was looking for the boyfriend over a debt. He attacked her, binding her hands with duct tape, covering her eyes and mouth, and putting a bag over her head. When detectives eventually tracked her down again years later in Galveston County, they uncovered another strange coincidence. She had once worked for Andy Atkinson's father. To this day, no one knows whether that connection meant anything or whether it was simply chance. That surviving victim worked with a renowned Houston police sketch artist, Lois Gibson, to create a composite drawing of her attacker. It was one of the only physical descriptions investigators had of the man believed responsible for both the assault and the Lovers Lane murders. In 2008, that sketch was digitally age progressed in the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize the face the man might have grown into. It was real progress. It confirmed a predator had been operating in the same part of Houston in the same narrow window of time in 1990. But when the DNA profile was run against every national criminal database available, it matched no one. Whoever this was, he had never been arrested for anything that required submitting a sample. Or if he had, it hadn't made it into the system. The case went cold again, but detectives kept circling back to it. In 2017, Houston television station ABC13 revisited the murders for a report called Missing Pieces. At the time, HPD detective Darkus Shorten held onto a specific hope that a new technique called familial DNA, using consumer genealogy databases like the ones behind popular ancestry testing kits, might one day identify relatives of the killer, and through them, the killer himself. Retired HPD detective Billy Belk had by then spent 2 decades of his career trying to track this case to its end without success. For years, the Henry and Atkinson families lived with a particular kind of grief. Not just the loss, but the not knowing. Cheryl's father would later describe it as so many dead ends and say he believed somebody out there knew something, even if they'd never come forward. Andy's mother spoke of missing him in the simplest, most human way, wishing they could just be together again, doing something as ordinary as spending a day at the beach. By 2020, DNA science had evolved into something the original investigators in 1990 couldn't have imagined: forensic genetic genealogy. Instead of just searching for an exact match to a known criminal, this newer technique builds a comprehensive genetic profile from crime scene evidence, then searches for genetic relatives. Second cousins, distant family members, anyone whose DNA shares enough in common to eventually trace a family tree back toward a single person. It's the same category of science that has helped identify decades-old unidentified remains and close some of the coldest cases in the country in recent years. Houston investigators brought in Othram, a private forensic DNA laboratory that specializes in exactly this kind of work, to take a fresh run at the Lovers Lane evidence. Using advanced genome sequencing, Othram scientists built a full DNA profile from the original 1990 crime scene material. One detailed enough to submit to the FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team for a deeper search. That search returned something the case had never had before: a candidate name, generated not from a database match, but from genetic family trees stretching outward from the DNA left behind at the scene 30 years earlier. Even with a candidate identified, investigators moved carefully. A genetic genealogy lead is a starting point, not proof. It would take more traditional investigative work before anyone could act on it. Then, in late 2025, a separate and far more direct piece of the puzzle arrived: a tip. Someone called Houston police and gave them a name. That name was Floyd William Parrott. A homicide sergeant began looking into it and found something that had been sitting in department records for nearly 30 years. A 1996 police report documenting a sexual assault allegation against a man named Floyd William Parrott. At the time, Parrott's account was that the encounter had been consensual, and a grand jury ultimately no-billed the case. No charges ever moved forward, but the 1996 investigation had produced a preserved DNA sample, and that sample had recently been entered into CODIS, the national database that automatically cross-checks DNA profiles across local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. Once Parrott's 1996 profile went into that system, it returned 2 matches. The first connected it directly to DNA collected during Cheryl Henry's sexual assault examination in 1990. The second connected that same profile to the unsolved 1990 assault of the nightclub employee, the case that had first linked to the Lovers Lane murders back in 2007. 3 cases tested decades apart. One man. Once detectives had Parrott's name attached to hard DNA evidence, they went back through his full criminal history, and the pattern that emerged was chilling in its precision. In May of 1988, more than 2 years before the murders, Parrott had been arrested and placed on probation for impersonating a peace officer. At the time of that arrest, records show he provided a work address just over 1 mile from where Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson would be killed 2 years later. In December of that same year, he was arrested again, this time for carrying a weapon, a blue steel revolver. He was convicted, and the weapon was later returned to him, standard procedure at the time. That detail mattered later. The description given by the June 1990 assault victim of the weapon her attacker carried matched that same blue steel revolver. Then, in May of 1990, mere weeks before the Lovers Lane murders, Parrott was arrested for impersonating a peace officer a second time. He was released on bond. It was while free on that bond that the June 1990 assault occurred, and it was while still free. With an open case, a documented pattern of pretending to be law enforcement, and a weapon matching one described by a recent victim, that Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson drove to a quiet road on the night of August 22nd. When Harris County District Attorney Sean Tier announced the charges in March 2026, he shared something the public had never seen before: photographs of a fake police car that investigators believe Parrott had driven around Houston during that period, using it to project false authority. Tier told reporters they believed there were victims of numerous different types of crimes connected to Parrott still living with the consequences today, and that his office needed the full picture of what he had done in the community. Investigators confirmed, methodically, case by case, that Parrott was never in police custody during any of it. Not during the June 1990 assault, not during the murders in August, not during the 1996 assault either. Every time, he was free, moving through the system, arrested, released, arrested again, never held long enough or connected to the right case at the right time for anyone to see the full pattern, until DNA technology finally caught up with the paper trail decades later. For 35 years, none of it connected. Multiple agencies: the Houston Police Department, the Harris County District Attorney's Office, and eventually the FBI. Each held a piece of it: an old assault report, a DNA sample sitting in a database, a family tree generated from genetic genealogy, a tip from someone willing to give a name. It took all of it, together, finally converging in late 2025 and early 2026 to turn a 35-year-old cold case into an arrest. On Wednesday, March 25th, 2026, FBI agents and Houston police located and arrested Floyd William Parrott in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was 64 years old, living quietly, far from the city where, decades earlier, he had allegedly committed one of its most notorious unsolved crimes. District Attorney Sean Tier said his prosecutors, working alongside HPD and the FBI, had pursued the investigation with relentless determination, working through hundreds of leads, dead ends, and years of frustration, but never giving up on Cheryl and Andy. He called the case one of the city's most haunting and infamous cold cases, and thanked every investigator who had ever touched it, saying their perseverance had finally delivered what two families had long deserved: progress and hope. For the families, the news arrived without warning. After 35 years of waiting, Cheryl's family released a statement calling the day bittersweet, expressing that they never imagined this day would come, and that they were overwhelmed with emotion after nearly 36 years. They thanked the Houston Police Department, the FBI, and everyone who had worked toward justice, along with the family and friends who had stood by them through every year and every small breakthrough. They said they had never given up hope. Parrott was booked into custody in Nebraska and initially fought extradition back to Texas, delaying the case's next chapter. He never got the chance to stand trial. In late April 2026, just weeks after his arrest, Floyd William Parrott was found dead in his cell at the Lancaster County Jail in Nebraska. Authorities said it appeared to be a suicide. The Lancaster County Sheriff's Office opened an investigation into the death, coordinating with the county's Department of Corrections. No trial. No verdict. No moment in a Houston courtroom where Cheryl and Andy's families would ever hear the man responsible explain, in his own words, what happened on that road in 1990. The case that had haunted a city for 36 years closed the way cold cases sometimes do. Not with the resolution people hope for, but with an answer. A name finally attached to a crime that had none for longer than either victim had been alive. What ultimately solved it wasn't a confession, and it wasn't a witness coming forward after decades of silence. It was a molecule of biological evidence, preserved carefully since 1990, waiting patiently through 17 years for DNA testing to exist, and then another 13 years beyond that for the science of genetic genealogy to develop enough to read a family tree instead of just a single match. In the end, it was a tip. Someone, somewhere, willing to say a name out loud that turned decades of scientific groundwork into an arrest within months. Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson went out for a night with friends in August of 1990 and never came home. For 36 years, the road where it happened kept its name, Lover's Lane, as a quiet, unwanted reminder of what was lost there. Their families waited longer than most people wait for anything in a lifetime. In the end, the answer came not from a courtroom, but from a lab, a database, and a phone call that finally connected the name to a crime scene frozen in time for 35 years. The Case Chronicle documents real cases, old and recent, where the truth came apart under investigation. All details in this video are drawn from official